More interestingly, perhaps, in today's context, is that Yuval Harari, in his Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind, one of those books to be bought at any airport, including, no doubt, in Oslo, came up with a very similar argument. And I must actually dig out, if I can find my notes in the right place, what Harari said. He essentially argued, today humankind has broken the law of the jungle. There is at last real peace and not just an absence of war. Harari's point should strike home even more than Pinker's for us if it were true. Harari, first of all, is a student of the history of war. That's where his work began. That's what his doctorate was on. He didn't begin writing about mankind as a whole, its past, present, and future. He began with the study of war and armed conflict. Furthermore, Harari is an Israeli. And I don't know about the Norwegian press, but in the last week in the UK, he has been writing commentaries on what has been happening in Gaza over the last week. He is living through directly the fact that war is present in his own country. But of course, he was living in an area which has been living with war since 1948 and the threat of war. So it was a remarkable statement, much more remarkable than Pinker, living in Canada, were saying that. He was living in an area as well as in an era, too many A's and E's in that, for it to be remarkable that he should say that. Now, the whole point here about this argument is that what Pinker and Harari, but Pinker especially because he's using the numbers, are saying is that it is the proportionate numbers of dead in war that are declining. In other words, global population is going down, loss of life through violence, the violence of other human beings. Sorry, global population is going up. What did I just say? Global population is going up. I should have had a graph, shouldn't I? And the losses of life through violent human agency is going down. As you probably know, we're not that far from Uppsala, as you probably know, there is a project called the Correlates of War, which has been trying to map exactly this problem since 1815. And therefore, it might seem reasonable for us to expect that at least for the last couple of centuries, we have pretty good data to produce this sort of analysis for. Much more problematic if we go back 1,000 years and we try and think through what is going on there. When states go to war, they are pretty clear about how many people they're mobilizing, where they're going to. They need to know their family members because they have to provide them with pensions. They need to know if they are killed and wounded because there is a financial liability for states. We should know what death rates are. The short answer is, even for the last 2 centuries, we haven't the foggiest idea, whatever Uppsala may say. And that is, I'm not criticizing their work because obviously you need to get some handle on this. The point here too, ultimately, is that it's absolute numbers that matter, not relative numbers. If you look at the Second World War, case in point, when I began life as an academic 4 decades ago, the normal death rate cited for the Second World War was 45 million dead. Now it's at least 65 million, and I heard Max Hastings speak, I think 2 weeks ago, and he suddenly said some people are saying it's 85 million. Where are those 40 million come from? Who was counting whom? It might include the Bengal famine, for example. British inflicted on the population of Bengal, a byproduct of the Second World War, massive in its consequences, which probably wouldn't have been included 40 years ago, but is now attributed to the war. And that in itself raises further questions. When people were looking at colonial wars in the 19th century, they might have counted, if they were colonial powers, their own losses. Did they account for the losses of those who were not under their rule, the people they were conquering? No, they didn't count them. Nobody was counting them. What do we do with civilian deaths? I work on the First World War. There is a reasonably robust figure for the military dead of the First World War. Golly, I better crack on. There is a reasonably solid figure, which is 8 to 10 million, still 2 million variation. But we have no idea how many civilians died in the First World War. Just take it from me, because I've got to get on with it. But the maximum figure could be 100 million if you wanted to include the flu epidemic. And even if you don't, most people at the time thought it was probably double the military dead. So 30 to 40 million was being talked about. There is another explanation for apparent decline in war, and that is interstate wars have become less frequent. And that has been true since 1945, and we can attribute that to two things. One is the success of the United Nations and the legal prohibition on going to war in the first place, first adumbrated the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. And the second, of course, is the unprovable argument that the possession of nuclear weapons has produced restraint on going to war. What has also, of course, occurred is the increase in civil wars. And that may be a temporary phenomenon. It may be a consequence of post-colonial settlements as states sort out their identities, having achieved independence. But it may also be the fact that actually we are looking at a definition of the state which is now so robust, and we've seen a proliferation in numbers of states, many of which are now so weak, that actually the scope for civil war and interstate war becoming confused with each other is much more frequent than much theory will allow for. And we're seeing, of course, internationalized civil wars going on, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq, and that has consequences too. So the argument that civil war is somehow distinct from international war actually looks rather less robust. The two need to be put together, in my view, in a way that often doesn't happen. What has also happened, and that this may be for both the above reasons as well, is our understanding of war has been determined by the assumption that because of this, we have got war, but it's limited. It can be contained. I won't develop this point because I'm up against the clock, but we can come back to it in discussion. But just think, for one example, that the way in which we decided to think about Russia-Ukrainian war in 2014 was in terms of hybrid warfare. That was largely NATO-determined rather than Russian-determined. But having seen it in those terms, that didn't provide us with a very good predictor of what would happen in February 2022. The point we need to remember there is when Clausewitz thought war would be limited, it wouldn't be limited because of its means, it would be limited because of its ends. It's what you were trying. War would still be very violent, whether it was fought for limited objectives or unlimited objectives.